Hi, my name is Erin Parks. I'm the founder and the Director of Research and Professional Development at the Lotus Center for Special Music Education, which is based in Ottawa, Canada. Today, I'm presenting to you an approach that we have been working on at Lotus Center for a number of years, using fixed dose solfege, manipulatives, and visual aids to support pitch learning in students with autism. I'm going to first go through the evidence behind this approach because it was developed as an evidence-based approach. And the way that we use it so that it can be replicated in other practice, and also preliminary results that we have found from data that we've been collecting in trying out this approach with students for a number of years. We've been using this approach with students across the autism spectrum, level 1, 2, and 3, with a lot of success, with a lot of trial and error. So I'm happy to present this approach to you today. First, I want to talk about the need for multimodality in teaching students with autism. And you'll see as we get into this approach that it's very much a multimodal approach based on what we know about how students with autism learn generally and particularly learn music. So we know that students with autism spectrum disorder have challenges processing various elements of traditional music learning. There are certainly strengths as well, and we will look at that. But let's first look at where they may need some adaptation or where using a multimodal approach can be beneficial for them. We know that students with autism often have difficulty with various aspects of auditory processing. A lot of work has been done in this area, a lot of research on a myriad of different elements of auditory processing. And so we see that some auditory processing is intact, but much is impaired in much of the population. We know particularly that this is true of language processing or sound processing, less so for music processing. We know that the visual spatial skills required for staff music reading can also be impaired, and particularly visual spatial working memory has been found to be impaired in a number of studies. This is a really important element of learning staff music reading. So even though we know that for some subsets, particularly of people with autism, there can be enhanced visual spatial skills for things like puzzles and visual spatial reasoning, visual spatial working memory is really required for something like staff music reading, and that has been found to be impaired. We know that there can be trouble understanding abstract concepts. And while to us as musicians, everything that we learn in music, the symbols and signs and ideas that we learn in music may now seem so ingrained to us that it's hard to remember how abstract they are. They really are very abstract. And so that can be a challenge for a lot of students with autism. And traditional music teaching often seeks to impart those abstract concepts in a way that students can understand. When students have difficulty understanding abstract concepts, then it is beneficial to use multimodal approaches using what they can see, what they can hear, what they can touch. Smell doesn't come in so much into play in music, but that could be true in more general teaching, but using these very tangible sensory abilities to bolster understanding of otherwise abstract concepts. We also know that imitation abilities may be limited in students with autism. Now, this is very important as it's often used in teaching various elements of music. Now, that's not to say that we can't use imitation. And in fact, when I get into demonstrations of this approach, you'll see that we do use that. All of this is to say that we need to understand that if we just use a single approach, there may be challenges there, and it can be helpful to bolster with others. So imitation abilities, things like learning by rote, may be limited in students with autism. We also know that language comprehension is typically impaired. This can be sometimes linked to elements of auditory processing, but there are also other neurocognitive elements at play here that contribute to deficits in language comprehension. So all of that to say that because there can be these impairments in various elements, if we're looking for a single pathway through which to teach music to students with autism, then we may be coming up short. And an approach combining the modalities using kinesthetic, visual, and auditory approaches, as well as looking at different ways of understanding and relating those modalities to each other, can allow for more holistic learning that is more likely to be able to use the students' strengths and bypass some of their weaknesses. Now let's look at auditory music processing specifically with people with auditory processing. So I mentioned that we know that auditory processing of sound and language can be impaired. Music processing is a little bit different, and there is a wealth of research on this area. This is just really a few, just a little taster of what's out there. We know that students with autism often have superior pitch processing, and particularly here, what I'm talking about is their ability to discern differences, small differences in pitch. So if you've ever had a student and you were trying to sing to them and you can't quite sing in tune, like me, or you're playing on an instrument that is not quite in tune, your student may be more likely to perceive that than typically developing students. We also know that students with autism or people with autism often have superior pitch memory. Also, we know that people with autism have superior disembedding and pitch labeling skills in certain incidences. So disembedding meaning if they hear a chord, most typically developing people hear that chord holistically. So for example, if it's a triad, we don't necessarily hear three separate pitches. We hear it as a single chord. Those people with autism are more likely to hear it as three separate pitches, or are more able to pick out those three separate pitches and label them. And we also know that people with autism have higher incidences of absolute pitch. There have been a number of studies done on this with various numbers found here, but certainly there's a wealth of evidence that there are higher incidences of absolute pitch generally in people with autism than the typically developing population. So now let's talk about what that means and how that led us to develop this approach. So here we're talking specifically about an approach to pitch learning. There are a lot of applications of all of the evidence that I just went through, and a lot more evidence to sift through for things like teaching rhythm, teaching music appreciation, teaching expression. But here we're going to speak specifically about pitch learning, and pitch learning really from beginning, the very first introduction, and all the way through to taking it to instrumental performance. And I'll mention again that we've used this approach now at the Lotus Center with over 100 students, well over 100 students now across the autism spectrum. And we've tested it in various settings. So private music lessons over a number of years to determine how it works from the very, very beginning to becoming somewhat more complex repertoire. Also how pitch memory is maintained over the time, and also using it in shorter duration settings like music camps. And so everything I'm presenting to you here has been tried in many different ways. So there are 4 key elements for a holistic approach that maximizes on multimodal and strengths-based learning that we incorporated here. One is singing in fixed do solfege. My background is as a Yamaha music education system teacher for many years. And this is where that came from for me, because that's used in the early childhood approach with the idea that children at that formative age, that program is designed for specifically ages 4 and 5, are more able to learn to have absolute pitch or relative pitch. And so in students with autism that already have a propensity towards enhanced pitch, it seemed to make sense that singing a fixed do solfege may be advantageous for these students. So this approach uses singing in fixed do solfege, meaning C, the letter C, is always do. It also uses color coding, linking the pitch names to the staff and to the instrument. This is not a new approach. This has been done in various approaches for people with autism and also other approaches. So for example, there's a lot of color coding used in students with dyslexia. Here we're linking it to a few other modalities to create a more holistic approach. Also movement through body tapping. So for example, when we sing the do tapping on the knees, re tapping on the tummy, me tapping on the chest. You could also use hand symbols. That's used in, there are various hand symbols used in different approaches. Kadai being the most well-known. We don't use that here. We find those hand symbols to be a little bit complex for some of the students that we're working with. And so for the purposes of this approach, we really stuck to very, very simple tapping different parts of the body for the different pitches. And using manipulatives. So I will show you some examples of manipulatives that we used. So step one from the very first lesson is introducing the pitches. As noted, we know that students, even students with level 1 autism, often have impairments in language comprehension. And so this can be done really with minimal explanation. The pitches are always sung in fixed do. And we would begin with pre-staff notation. Now I want to note here, everything that I present has been tried with lots of variation, very purposefully, because I really don't believe that there is one fixed way or one method for all students with autism. These are tools to be used or not used or used in different ways. So they are designed to be individualized to the needs of the student. If you have a student with level 1 autism who is an older student or a student who is twice exceptional and is gifted, perhaps pre-staff notation would not be needed. But this is an approach that can be incorporated in different ways. I'm going to show a short video now that very simply demonstrates how I would first introduce the cards and the pitches. They're simple cards like this. You'll see them in the video. We use them a lot. Mine are well worn. You'll see that in the video as well. And I simply lay them out and present them as in the video. Do, do, do. Tapping on the do. Now re, 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 re. Tapping on the re. Now me, 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 me. Tapping on the me. Now fa, 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 fa. Tapping on the fa. Now so, 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 so. Tapping on the so, so, fa, mi, re, do. So really it would be presented just like that, just laying them out and modeling. There doesn't need to be a lot of explanation. From there, I would have the student tap with me. If they wanted to sing, they could, but often it's a week or two of just modeling and tapping. From there, there are a lot of games that we can play with these that I'm not going to get into right now. We can do imitation games like saying, give me a do, re, mi, and the student needs to tap, or me, find the me, any kind of game like that. Again, there are endless variations possible here. Step 2 is to link those pitches to the instrument using manipulatives and color coding. I've put some pictures here of different examples of ways that we have done that. So my primary instrument is piano, though this has been used with a variety of instruments. So the first step often that I would use, again, depending on the needs of the student, is what you see in the picture all the way on the left. Large foam keyboard pieces where we lay them out there first. It takes away some of the anxiety of going right to the instrument and puts an extra step in. It also allows a lot of manipulation because we can take the cards and just put down the does, then I can have them put them in order. Sometimes we even need an extra step of just identifying the groups of 2 and 3 black keys, whatever the student needs here, but working with that as an in-between from just identifying the pitches as demonstrated in the video clip to identifying where they're going to go on the instrument can be helpful. You can see in the picture on the right, I just use very, very simple little stickers. They come off very easily. They're meant to come off easily. You can buy stickers that are color coded, but I like these because they allow me to personalize. If for any reason I'm doing anything different, you could also write the names on the notes if you wanted to. I'm just going to mention a quick note here also why I use solfege instead of letter names. It's because it's easier to sing the solfege. And so because we're teaching so much by singing, that's what we're going to use here. You could also use boom whackers or colored handbells, or there are little glockenspiels. These color codes, the solfege cards that I have match those color coding. So we can very simply then just move on. And then the first step would be to sing that same solfege tapping song, but either playing, you could play it on the piano, tapping on the piano foam keyboard, doing with the bells. So I would sing do, 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 ring the do bell, or whatever you're doing. And then the final step is to transfer that to the instrument. And this is where the pitch memory piece really comes in. So you can see here, I just used a song, this Mexican Hat Dance from an Alfred's Method book, to demonstrate that this can really be used with any repertoire. And so I colored all the notes. Again, this can be personalized. So if the student doesn't need all of the notes colored and they're able to do some staff reading, that's great. If you needed to do this even just using the cards and they're not doing any staff reading, that is fine as well. There's a lot of variation that's possible here. So what we would do is sing the solfege of this note, of this piece. So I would model it first. So I would sing it all. So, me, and so on. Then if the student is able to imitate me, I would sing and have them sing it back. So, me, sing, and so on. But the student learns it by hearing the pitches or singing if they can. And then because we've done fixed do solfege and they then know where all those notes are, and they've learned it by pitch memory, by singing, they just have to transfer that to their instrument. We have the visuals here to support that. So again, the multimodality, putting in as many different ways and modes of learning as possible to support each other. So we know that visual supports can be very helpful, particularly if there were any difficulties with understanding the abstract concepts or language. We know that pitch memory is enhanced, and so we are using that by teaching through pitch memory. And we're also using the color coding right on the keys to make that link between the staff and the keys to take out some of that abstractness of staff music reading. If they don't need color coding on the keys or on whatever instrument you're using, then that's great. You don't need to use it, but all of these tools are here if needed. So some key pedagogical points: adapt to the individual student's strengths. You may find that some students really need the reading element and need to point and read at the same time, and some less. Just work with what your student has. We only use adaptations that are needed in order to promote independence and learning through the zone of proximal development. This is important. So if they don't need color coding or they don't need stickers on the keys, don't use them. We want to just put in supports that will actually support learning, but by keeping the student in their zone of proximal development, always pushing them to learn as much as they can. We also phase out adaptations over time as able. So for example, in that last example, I would perhaps, when we have repeated patterns, so the first time we did so me, I would color it, and the second time not, so that the student is recognizing the pattern and is beginning to take away the color coding from there. Some students will always need color coding, and that's okay as well. And again, it can be applied to any repertoire. So some outcomes from preliminary data that we have collected at Lotus Center, we see that we have very high retention levels of students, over 90% year over year, using this approach. And we believe that that is because of the demonstrated improved self-efficacy. The students feel good about their learning. They're having a positive experience. They have accelerated instrumental proficiency. We're seeing that students using this approach are able to play more early. They're not being held back by not being able to read because we're putting all of these elements together. They have reduced anxiety in the music learning process, and their pitch memory is quite pervasive. Sometimes for years, they will remember the pitches associated with the song. Our next step is now to compare this approach with others to actually measure some of these things in relation to other approaches and with control groups. Here are the references for this presentation. I thank you very much for your time.